If your ancestors came to the US in the last few centuries, they likely have an immigration story. Now, understanding their journey is key to discovering your family's history. I am John Bowman, and in this video I'll explore 5 key areas that may have shaped your ancestors' journey from Europe to the USA. Now, if you've ever struggled to find an immigration record, a missing passenger list, or a name that seems to vanish from history, these factors may explain why. If you can't find your ancestors' arrival record, they may have taken an indirect route to the US, and this was more common than you might think. Many immigrants didn't sail directly to the US, instead they arrived via other countries before continuing their journey. Now, there's several reasons for this. Some immigrants took an indirect route because it was cheaper. In many cases, it cost less to travel to Canada or via the UK rather than booking a direct passage to New York. So it may well be you see the Canadian journey or a journey from the UK. Now, others had no choice but to stop in an intermediate country because there was no direct shipping routes from their homeland. Now, many people from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe had to travel from ports like Hull, Liverpool, Hamburg and Rotterdam before they could board a ship bound for the US. Now, some immigrants chose to arrive in Canada or South America because the countries had fewer restrictions than the US and maybe were more welcoming to new arrivals. Now, before the 20th century, places like Canada had very few entry requirements than the United States. Now, many European, Finnish and Eastern European immigrants transitioned through the UK before heading to America. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, my hometown of Hull on England's east coast processed over 2 million immigrants who moved from Hull to Liverpool and then took the ship from Liverpool to the US. In the same way, Italians and Greeks often travel through France, while many Russians and Polish Jewish immigrants passed through the Netherlands before reaching the US. So look for those different ports of entry. Now, talking about ports of entry, Ellis Island may be the famous, but it wasn't the only gateway to America. Millions of immigrants actually entered the US through other ports like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Galveston, Boston. There's about 8 major ports that your ancestor may have come in through. So if you can't find your ancestry in New York, they may have arrived somewhere else. Now, some of these immigrants chose smaller ports because they knew those locations had fewer restrictions and regulations, so it may be easier to enter the US if they were worried about those things. Now, depending on the time period, certain ports required less paperwork or had fewer medical inspections regarding the ship as it came in. Now, others arrived at ports that were primarily used for cargo, like New Orleans. Merchant vessels often had extra space and immigrants could buy passage on those ships rather than traveling on crowded passenger lines. And that was particularly true of the Germans going to New Orleans. Now, some ports became popular with certain ethnic groups. Irish and Italian immigrants often arrived in Boston because they already had family and community networks there. Many Germans and Italians came through New Orleans, and French too. And while Galveston and Texas were major entries for Eastern European Jewish immigrants. So, as you're looking at your family tree, if your ancestors settled in the South or the Midwest, there's a fair chance they arrived through a Gulf Coast port like New Orleans or Galveston rather than Ellis Island. And staying with Ellis Island, one of the biggest myths in genealogy is that Ellis Island officials changed immigrant names. In reality, passenger lists were created before departure by European clerks, not American immigration officers. That means your name will be incorrect in the manifest. Now, that mistake likely happened before they even boarded the ship. But names didn't just change on passenger lists. Many factors influence how a name evolved over time. Now, there's many census records available in the US, and census takers often wrote names based on how they heard them spoken. That means that your ancestor name may have been spelled differently, even from one census to the next, completely different in some cases. Now, the names could be changed in birth, marriage and death records. Sometimes a person's name was Americanized, shortened or even recorded incorrectly by officials just because they couldn't hear or phonetically hear the name correctly. Now, for businesses, especially shops and stuff like that, immigrants changed their names to sound more American too, to make more business. They may have shortened a long surname, typical long European surname, or changed it completely entirely to make it easier to pronounce. Now, if an early arriving family member changed their name, later relatives may adopt the same name, or even choose a different one, so you have families with different names completely. Now, when it came to naturalization and citizenships, often immigrants went back to their legal name, their legal immigrant name, so your ancestors officially changed their names when becoming a US citizen. This will explain why they appear under different names in different records. Many immigrants altered their names to avoid discrimination too. This was especially common for Irish, Jewish and Eastern European immigrants, especially in the Northeast. They faced prejudice in certain industries or regions. Now, many second generation immigrants, children of immigrants, chose to Americanize their name of their parents once they moved away from home. So you'll get different families with different names. So if your ancestor's name is not appearing in immigration records, don't give up. Look at census records, marriage certificates, business directories, and naturalization files, or even the family around them. Name changes often happen gradually, and sometimes by accident, sometimes by choice, and sometimes out of necessity. Now, for chain migrations, let's look at chain migrations. Most immigrants didn't arrive in the US alone. They followed family, neighbors, and other people from their hometown. So if you're struggling to find your ancestor, look at who they traveled with and where the people from their region settled in the US. That can provide very critical clues. This is called a fan club, friends, associates and neighbors. So look at those people as they come. So move away from your family brick wall and look at other people. Now, this chain migration was a common pattern. Typically one family member, often a father or older brother, migrated first, found work, then sent money back home so others could follow. And people from the same village often travel together. If you look at passenger lists, we can see frequently multiple families from the same hometown on the same ship. Now, once in the US, immigrants tend to settle in communities where others from their homeland are already established, and we can see this in census records. Germans often settled in Milwaukee and Cincinnati, Italians in New York and New Orleans, Scandinavians in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And also religious institutions and community networks also played a big role in where people went to live. Many immigrants relied on churches, synagogues, fraternal organizations to find housing, jobs, and their own social connections. So if you can't find your ancestry in immigration records, try looking for their fellow travelers, relatives, or other people from their village, even if they didn't travel at the same time. This approach can often lead to finding missing records. Then finally, different times, different laws. Not every immigrant left behind an official record. Before the early 20th century, US immigration laws were loosely enforced, and many people simply arrived without any documentation. So for much of US history until the beginning of the 20th century, immigration was largely unregulated. There were no formal inspections or paperwork. Many arrivals simply walked off the boat and started their new life, or walked across the border from Canada without documentation and started their life. Now, strict immigration laws didn't take effect until the early 20th century, and that was really focused on Asian immigrants initially. Even after that, many immigrants, even as we find today, found their ways around restrictions, whether by entering through different ports, using family connections, or crossing borders unofficially. Borders were loosely patrolled, if you like, at that time. So if your ancestor doesn't appear in immigration records, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't follow the proper process. It just means that at the time they arrived, record keeping was inconsistent or not required, or those records are lost. So we have 5 key factors that may shape your ancestors' immigration journey when you can't find them in the records. Maybe they took an unexpected route, entered a smaller port, changed their name multiple times, followed family and friends at a time when records were scarce. Now, if this video helped you think differently about your ancestors' immigration journey, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. It's hugely important for a small channel like mine, and it really helps this channel grow and reach more family historians like you. And if you're wondering how to actually find the records we've talked about, Don't miss my next video, which will be focused on how we can find these records or where we can find them online. It will be covering research strategies and the best online resources for US immigration, so stay tuned. Anyway, thanks for watching and great luck with your research.